Grifter's Bible, a novel by El Shaboons, read by El Shaboons, with sound design by Monumental Sonic Architecture. Chapter 1. When the past was present, it was Prelude. Now it is just history.
The angels say a flood's a sure sign a false prophet's getting born. My Nanny Franken used to creep me right out of my galoshes when she spoke in spooky non sequiturs like that any time it ever rained more than a drop on her morning walks to school. Nanny was long gone when it finally happened, but her witchy words were the most apt description for what happened at that first Sunday service we held in Deep Ellum. Even now the echoes of her words send a shiver up my spine like a cat's walking over my grave. It was in the armpit of that awful autumn at the height of the Great Recession when a monumental thunderhead shaped like the hand of God swept down out of the Texas sky and washed a poor huddled mass of gray matter onto the doorstep of Joseph Smith. Seth was the single greatest bullshit artist that I have ever known. He came to the table with songs of salvation and shouted out to a city full of sinners with a tongue that shined like silver. I supplied a black patented solenoid that filled the sanctuary walls with a well of power that stirred up electromagnetic visions of God from right out of the dusty substance that lay sleeping between our sheep's ears. From the bleeding edge of neurotheology to the state-of-the-art in Michigas, within 6 months of that first flood, we convinced half of the Bible Belt and all of the angels in heaven that God had shown his face in a bombed-out warehouse space on Commerce Street in the heart of Deep Ellum, Texas. The historic scope of the collapse of the U.S. economy was vast, and bodies kept dropping as the American dream circled the bowl. One deposed CEO flew a plane into the IRS building. A soccer mom drove her minivan full of kids off the top of the High-Five overpass. Dr. James Abraham lit himself on fire while trying to destroy his home lab and the secrets he was uncovering there. Dr. Abraham was the pioneer of the cerebral cortex that inducted me into a secret college of arcane knowledge that heavily encrypted whispers called neurotheology. He survived the burns technically, but his spirit was broken like never before. When Dr. Abraham didn't return to work, I was released from my contract with IM, the Institute for Applied Magnetics, the federally funded research facility in Grand Prairie where the Navy had established the Abraham Skunk Works. I took my severance package and purchased one drug-fueled nervous breakdown that reached its nadir on the 4th of July. My shitty hangman's knot slipped loose shortly after I passed out. I woke up with a lump in my throat and the judge committed me to a 6-week inpatient rehabilitation program at Timberglen Psychiatric. It was the same place Dr. Abraham's federal insurance had shuffled him off to during his recovery. All James and I talked about for 6 weeks was God and the brain, because what else were we going to do? You ready? Seth was there to pick me up on the morning of my discharge. I'm not ready for anything. I piled into the back of the cab with my fading purple collar of bruises. The cab pulled away just as a black Buick with murder-tinted windows pulled up to the porte-cochere. All that cruel summer the people of Dallas were sieged with disease and heat, hemmed in by a hopelessness born out of fear, in a city bleached bone-white by the day. Food banks were running dry as the homeless rolls spiked. Shortages on all of the staples led to civil unrest all over town. Swarms of mosquitoes crossed the overfed marshes in the flooded Trinity riverbed by moonlight and seeded the city with a plague of West Nile virus on a proportion unseen in previous years. Rats and roaches ran riot in the city while grasshoppers, locusts, and cicadas bore down in droves of suburban pestilence. Across the metroplex, a clicking infantry of crickets added a maddeningly relentless chitinous percussion to the demented nighttime parade song of the pandemic. Triple-digit temperatures marched up from the Gulf of Mexico and sat on the city like a sweaty baby Huey. The Dallas night was a hothouse, and the humidity levels didn't dip after sunset. Heatstroke stalked the projects like a thief in the night. Only the dead slept through the sirens. Some reporter on the radio read out the names of the dead like a roll call. I looked down from the overpass and watched people and dogs roaming the sticky streets, wading through rising waves of convection like zombies moping in hidden surf. Water bans were in effect, and all of the lawns were leached of green. The city council was calling for a state of civic emergency. Even the easy freeze is jacked up from people using it too much. Seth threw his hands up at his own existential woe. Then he spoke forward and told the taxi driver, "Here, just take this next exit for me. We'll take the back way. I'll show you." Then he elbowed my arm and gave me the eyes. We ditched the cab at the red light at the bottom of the ramp. The light turned green and the cabbie was forced to drive through or face the wrath of the overheated cars behind him if he ditched the cab and gave chase. We doubled back under the bridge and hunkered up in the shadows for a half hour, 2 grown men hiding beneath I-30. The cabbie passed by our spot plenty of times, honking to the ether and shouting foreign profanities before giving up and moving on. I hate doing that. I groused on my way out of the bushes. Not like he's got a pot to piss in. I felt bad for the cabbie, but Seth shrugged it off and lit a cigarette. Get real. Seth belched baritone smoke and started to sermonize in the stultifying heat. Better get off the pot glasses. Desperate times, desperate measures. I know you don't want to hear this right now, but we got to rally. My landlord's a cunt here from kicking me out of the studio over all the back rent I owe. Don's not a bear you want to cross. He waggled a warning finger. He flicked his ash into the nearest dry brush and snorted ruefully. My phone got cut off on Monday, so at least I've got an excuse for not taking his calls. Seth stuck his nose in the air, turned on a heel, and then got to strutting. To witness all 6'5" of him oafing down the block, shining like a star with one of the earpieces on his shades missing, was to be confounded by his privileged stride. This monstrosity of a human being, with a catastrophe of a face, always carried his shoulders high. His chest was perpetually pumping red blood, and his arms and hair swung in cinematic rhythm with one another. No matter what he lacked in conventional visual appeal, Seth more than made up for with relentless charisma, substantial cunning, and an ability to deliver epic gestures with an effortless elan. He came from oil, but his parents had disowned him at 19 when he went to Huntsville for selling acid at St. Mark's. Seth walked out of jail at 21 with a job offer on a road crew, a GED, and a black belt in karate. He had a Grammy by 25. Weathering vicissitudes was Seth's stock in trade. Enough with that office job you keep moaning over. Those days are done. It's a lab, not an office. I listened to Seth hawking me in Chinik for 14 blocks about selling fake dope, selling real dope, manufacturing acid gas capsules, or opening an underground Texas Hold'em casino. I was glazing over when I looked forward and caught a glimpse of the sun glinting off of something outside the front gate of Seth's loft on Commerce. God damn it, you turd, Seth's landlord Don barked as we approached. I ought to kick your ass for getting me out in this heat. At 5'4" in Cuban heels, Don was even shorter than I was, but his size belied his grit. He was a stone-cold Texas gangster. He owned half the real estate in Deep Ellum, and he did not take shit. Give me my money or I'm padlocking this sumbitch. Seth's swagger didn't slip. We're headed to hook it up right now. He flicked his thumb at me. I was just picking up my Hebrew over here. He knows how to collect. Please. Don rolled his eyes at me. He crossed his arms on his chest and I read the blue tattooed legend fading into the ruddy chicken skin on his left forearm. Don't piss me off, because I will kill you. A cartoon bulldog in a general's helmet chewed a cigar and frowned. Don, you know I'm ready to lay down whatever I've got to lay down to get these last 2 signatures on this settlement. Word of honor. I got these suckers on the run. Seth clapped his hands like he was tickled by the thought. Shoot, if this thing goes good, you're probably about to get all your back rent. Plus, maybe a little interest. Then I'm getting my gear out of hock and opening the studio back up. That? Seth snapped his fingers and smiled. That's when things will really go back to how they were. You'll see. I promise. Seth could sell incense to the Pope, but Don's pretty agnostic, and he doesn't smoke weed. 30 days or I'm deballing you, boy. Don hitched his bootcut jeans back up on his non-existent hips. I don't want promises, and I got no use for manure. I like your jib, you ain't wrong about that, but it's only because I like you that I ain't got your broken ankles dangling from my rearview mirror right now. I got oil barrels in Port Aransas stuffed full of gimps that owe me a lot less than you do. It's a final warning. Show up at my office in 30 days with the money or your keys. Else I swear to God and Nolan Ryan, I will personally bean your sorry hide right out of this town so fast it'll hair lip the governor. Don reseated his cowboy hat and spat out a plug. Get on it. With that, he stalked back across Commerce Street, halting rush hour traffic with a glare. A quick breeze cut 10 degrees off the temperature. A low-slung cloud bank drifted like a shroud across the face of the day. The red light turned the sky nuclear. My glazed eyes followed Seth's buzzing orange Corona. A disc in his back was all jacked up from a motorcycle wreck, and every bit of his recording business had dried up while he gagged up all of his assets. He had self-medicated while he waited for an elusive insurance settlement to come through, and now his septum was eaten away, and he'd burned all of his clients, and most of his remaining friends. I watched him disappear into the yawning dark inside of the loft. The space was huge, but it seemed even more cavernous with all of Seth's recording gear pawned off for dope. Woo! Hallelujah! Home sweet home. But listening to him holler in the void, you'd never know that Seth was down. He made the darkness vibrate with volume and enough attitude to convince you that something great would be there when he turned on the lights. I followed him into the darkness. I was walking right behind him when he lifted his leg. I dundered right into his stink. The smell of barn dirt and burnt tacos pie-eyed me in the face, and I audibly gagged. He giggled to himself. I sobered to the genuine reality of Seth. Gross, broke, and sweating blow. Now who'd hang a star on that? Get your shit kicker's glasses. Seth emerged from out of an inky alcove of the loft. We're going to the fair. He thrust a copy of the Dallas Century, the free weekly, at me. Big Tex's dumb wooden face smiled back up from the cover. It illuminates your senses was emblazoned in loud red Helvetica across his chest. I thought we were working on this thing with Don. Sometimes you gotta kick a mule in the nuts to get him to pull that plow. Billy Goat got a whole pound of mushrooms to sell during state fair season, and he owes me a few grams. You in? A peaceful mist of drizzle dappled the sunburnt streets of Dallas. Greasy steam rose up like gins dancing in the cobalt twilight. A pair of dinged-up pigeons lit under cover of the canopy over Seth's front door while I watched him chopping up 5 grams of Puerto Rican mushrooms with a pair of kids' safety scissors out on the patio. I shooed the birds with the toe of a chuck, and then Seth gave me my half of the jumble of caps and stems. We each drained a can of Dr. Doctor, and then Seth belched his ABCs. Are you gonna lock the front door before we leave? I picked my teeth on the verge. Why? There's nothing to steal. Seth's dreads were embroidered with dew, a tiny knit of jewels glowing like Tang on ice beneath the streetlights. I closed the door behind me. We half skated on the oil-slick streets on our way over to catch the Dart Light Rail to Fair Park. It was the weekend of the big Grambling versus Prairie View showdown at the Cotton Bowl, and admission was reduced to $2 on the night before the State Fair Classic. The train cars and fairgrounds were filled to riot capacity. It felt like every high school kid in the state had shown up to fight or finger one another in public on the eve of the big game. We passed bare-knuckle boxing matches in the parking lot and erotic petting sessions on the steps of the Hall of State. Walking through the crowd was like wading through a cornfield of sweating bodies. The kids were so amped up, running free, absolutely losing their minds. They called each other stupid names and made obscene hand gestures. Enslaved by their hormones, they foamed at the mouth, enthralled to a mass psychosis. But even in the eye of all that nubile pandemonium, Seth still managed to draw a heroic dose of the attention his way. He pulled lurid glances and bratty catcalls from out of the girls and boys alike. Both the young and old squinted at him like he was calculus. Seth united all races into a coalition of fascination, and a melee of wonder opened up in his wake. Folks ran up just to stop him and ask if he was someone famous. Seth just said, "Not yet," and laughed like the king of comedy. If he'd pulled a flute out of his ass, he could have marched all of his admirers into the Gulf of Mexico. The clouds began to break apart. Under a big top of starlight, the fanfare of chaos was the sound of Seth's parade. The rapid pneumatic whoomph of air rifles and the steeplechase sirens announced his entrance onto the midway. The harsh swarp of blunt darts and soft cork and the breezy chingling of change at the coin toss provided an improvised anthem so his sandaled feet could march. The clickety-clack of bamboo hoops and the lunatic clang of bells at the shootout were strange carnal music to salute Seth's passage. He looked like a prophet on his way to meet the president, swaggering with purpose, pleased with himself, navigating by a star. I looked back and giggled under the gaze of what felt like 1,000 faces following in Seth's giddy cortege. Then I looked up and realized that this makeshift army had reached the Texas Star. Ancient mechanics whirred and clattered as our tipsy car left the ground with a jerk. Rising above the smell of cotton candy and horse shit, the lighted spoke whirled up into the sky, lifting us up like the Wheel of Fortuna. Shrinking into the distance at our feet, a Shriner band played When the Saints Go Marching In on the back of a flatbed trailer. Seth's pubescent legion gawked as he lifted off into the night. They bled away back onto the midway. I let my head loll back on the railing. Silent lightning illuminated the orange and purple night. "What's up with that cheese, Franken? You see any holes?" Seth's tympanic voice boomed in my ear. I flinched and turned away to where the moon had dislodged itself from a rack of cloud. I stared at Crater Tycho and waited for the man in the moon to shuffle out of the umbra with some kind of lunar wisdom. I thought about rockets and all the fuel it would take to rise above our situation. I thought about Crater Parsons hidden on the other side of the moon. Jack Parsons got rich off of rocket fuel. He had big friends with crazy ideas, and one idea in particular popped into my head at that moment. I felt the tip of a sword pierce the knot that had cinched my brain up. Something occurred to me. The stars smeared as my gaze dropped back down to Seth. "You know, people say if you want to get rich, start a religion." The young couple on the opposite bench in the car moved closer together and stared at me with disturbed eyes. Seth threw his head back and guffawed. He was outlined in that same orange light from before, like he was a beacon. Behind his bucking shoulders, the city lights arrayed in blinking waves that seemed to pulse like a living electric cape plugged into his wild man's mess of cable-like hair. He added the obvious caveat. "It's funny, but what kind of people are going to buy the gods in my Rolodex?" We both glanced over at the couple and they shook their heads no. His words were a purple bashing to my in-coat notion, but the sherbet corona around Seth's head would not dissipate. My mind started picking through the heady conversations that Dr. Abraham and I had shared over the course of my time at Timberglen. God is just a neurological condition. Illuminated freeways and raised arterial thoroughfares arced through the night like veins of sodium and neon pumping electricity into Seth's soul. I'd seen the scene before. The brain is just a machine. It's this fatty little computer sitting in a bath of conductive proteins. I held my hands out in front of me like I was caressing a globe, a football, a hydrogen bomb. All that soup transmits electrical pulses and translates them into event potentialities. Do this, don't do this. There are miles and miles of these on-off switches crammed inside your head. And there's a whole spectrum of flaws and interhemispheric intrusions that can be jacked with. Dr. Abraham had decades of electroencephalograms showing the mounting evidence for his case that all human bodily states, from hoping or dreaming to conditions like twilight or hunger, were tied to signature brainwave patterns with definable frequencies and wave shapes. James said the electrochemical existence of God can get downright undeniable once the correct combination of ones and zeros was brought to bear on the temporal lobe. In the lab, I had watched him summoning complexities like love or hate like they were functions of math or an arrangement of music. He had a whole catalog of these patterns. "So," said Seth, "mystical experiences are derived out of transient electrical microseizures in the temporal lobe too." I drew on my palm like Helen Keller. "What if you didn't have to convince anyone of your divinity? What if you just had to keep talking for a while?" Seth pursed his big old lips with something that crinkled like caution. "What's a while?" I considered my apps and James's old drawings. I don't know. Give me maybe an hour? What happens after an hour? Seth canted his head ruefully, a hint of doubt coloring his tone of voice. I shot for the moon. What if you were the one preacher that could guarantee God showed up every Sunday? I'd be fine as frogs there if I was thinking you could actually pull it off. He threw down a gauntlet. I had to throw something profound at him. I know how to target the temporal lobe of the brain with rapid, irregular bursts of magnetism to imitate microseizures around the amygdala and the hippocampus. With the right setup, I can slide in and access memory centers, pain receptors, the whole neocortex. I broke it down. I can create this ultimate state that we call the holy presence. It's a whole mind-body notion that God is actually physically present. I looked him deep in his roomy eyes. You're a top mocker. I know you could ramble on long enough to let the burst patterns line up. I slapped my palms together. When that gets going, the bicameral brain starts gushing feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters, and it's... I snorted and snapped my fingers. I know people would pay for that feeling. Seth was actually speechless. I had taken control of a conversation with him for the first time ever. Seth's eyebrows arched. His shoulders were rising and falling at the speed of his breath. Seth's eyes pinned behind the limpid reflection of the wheel's illuminated struts. A muscle in his jaw wriggled as he fought back a smile. He breathed deep and the skyline rose up behind him. I saw vistas opening up in Seth's eyes as we floated back down to the ground. The spark of possibility lit him from within. And if I'd listened closer, I might have heard the thunder of the masses, crying out his name on some future Sunday as he sat there daydreaming about preaching while kneading one of his tendrils of hair. His chin lifted. His shoulders rose. His chest began to expand. But then he stopped. Well, if we can't afford a pack of cards to open a casino, how are we going to get a hold of all this? He wiggled the fingers on one hand next to his ear. Business of yours. Seth gave voice to the presence of the same fatal flaw from every one of our other plans. I could cobble a lot of chewing gum and inspiration together to bluff my way through the construction of one of James's most basic mock-ups. But there was a solenoid, a piece of hardware analogous to the human brain in function. It was unique and too complex to be mocked by some hasty salmagundi of junk. In order to induce the sort of high-level states of consciousness in the temporal lobe that I was boasting of, it takes multiple wavelengths occurring at somewhere between 20 and 25 milliseconds, repeated along any frequency band greater than 40 Hz. Derivative effects can be summoned by toggling between different signals in that frequency. Each signal had to be accurate within a 6.3 to 7.8 Hz range of variance to the raw source. Once the simultaneous variations got to running along a very narrow bandwidth between 5 Hz and 6 Hz, harmonic frequencies would emerge and begin to generate continuous recreations of transcerebral events. Only one machine could handle the calculations. And that's where the grift hit a wall for me. I admitted defeat. Nah, you're right. The only way is to lift it from IM before the Navy comes to collect their property, if they haven't picked it up already. I was making a statement confirming the impossible, not a suggestion. Seth didn't take it that way. He scratched his beard and eventually nodded in conspiracy. Okay. You find out where it's at and figure out how we can get in and out of there without getting pinched. I'll call Fat. Wait, what? I'm not planning a break-in. This seemed reasonable to me. Don't need to. Seth was nonchalant. I can think of at least 3 major security flaws that you told me about while you were working at that place. I damned Seth's eidetic memory. Seth quoted my own long-forgotten words back to me verbatim. He recalled the exact dates of 12 occasions spread out over 5 years on which I'd mouthed off about either the gates, the private security officers, or the minimal cameras. He was right. They were a government contractor, but IM security systems were a joke. It's a reasonably open campus since the kind of research that goes on there is mostly theoretical. There's just not a ton of spying or theft. But they're going to notice something like that's missing. I warned of the obvious. Are they? Seth reminded me that I used to bitch about how different pieces of hardware that the skunkworks had developed would sit around cluttering up the lab for months. He could pull up any ill word I ever said about IM and use it against me. We'll never get away with it, I mumbled to myself as I shook my head. Seth scooted to the edge of the bench and gushed. Glasses, if you're not talking out of your ass about what you can do with this thing, and it's just sitting somewhere, then we'd be a couple of dims not to at least borrow the thing for a minute. It'll be fine. We'll take her out on a little joyride, see how she handles. Hell, maybe we'll even make Don happy again. He grinned like a game show host offering me Pharaoh or the sea. He could see I wasn't in yet. Listen, we're only gonna need your little solenoid long enough for me to get my gear out of the pawn shop and open the studio back up. We'll return it right back where we got it from after that. Happy? It was no use. It was like asking a tidal wave not to bowl you over. You promise? I was a kitten in a corner. Why wouldn't I? Seth shrugged like a preoccupied crocodile, and then he leaned back with a self-satisfied grin. Swear to God. I could see the grift was already well in progress in Seth's mind. I looked around helpless. The skinny couple on the other bench clung to one another like hostages avoiding a pile of grenades. Hey, y'all aren't going to tell anybody what we were talking about, are you? Nadie nos creía. The boy looked up with impatience. Dios te está mirando. The girl answered him with her eyes wide, in fear of lightning striking the car. At that, we touched down, and the stickman wrenched the door open from the outside with a twist. We let the couple leave first, and they made a run for it. We bolted for home to lay the foundations of our plan. The wheels began to turn. Seth's mushroom connection Billy Goat had a little brother named Beryl who delivered parts to all of the boathouses in Denton County. Beryl light-fingered 24 deep cycle marine batteries from the inventory of a vendor up at Texoma for us. Then Seth called Fat. Fat wasn't really fat, but everyone called him Fat because Seth did. Seth always had the kid tripping over himself doing mitzvahs for us because Seth was his godhead. And his mom had a car. Fat was driving us over to pick up the batteries from Beryl while I was describing the output device that would be necessary to push the purest signal. It's going to take enough surface area to create a beam that won't attenuate into nothing before it hits the opposing wall. It's got to be bigger, like this. I spread my hands out to illustrate. Like a manhole cover? Fat mumbled into the rearview mirror. Yeah, I guess, I confirmed with a shrug. The foundry that makes those for the city laid my mom off last month. Fat announced a little notice. She told me they started cheaping out on materials back in 2005, stopped intermingling concrete. Any manhole covers that the city replaced after 2005 were pure iron, 2 inches thick and nearly 2 feet in diameter. The size was a match, and their weight would dampen the ambient vibrations created by the well. On the second floor of Seth's loft, there was a utility tunnel that only I was small enough to fit into. If I crawled on my hands and knees, there was a tiny garret at the end of the plywood tunnel. One wall of what I called the rat's nest was built out with a crawl space that spanned the width of the loft's facade and gave me access to the vertical space inside the walls behind the sheetrock and soundproofing. With only 24 inches of vertical clearance, the wriggling journey to the western wall was hell on my claustrophobia. But when I reached the end of the crawl space, I dropped a plate slug into the darkness. I heard it ping on concrete. There was clear space all the way down. That night there were 8 missing manhole-related traffic incidents around downtown Dallas. It took 4 days to complete 8 successful drops with toe straps intact and the cable still attached, but I finally got the discs situated in the space inside the loft's east and west wall. But that was just the beginning. At 130 pounds apiece, I got one hell of a workout muscling each battery down the tiny access way that led to the rat's nest. Panting like death's hand was on my heart, I situated my burden in the crawl space where I'd framed out a basic 2x4 cradle for all 24 of the batteries to sit in. I wired the batteries in series in 4 sets of 6. I taped and prepped all of the lines. Seth was waiting with Fat's phone when I crawled back out. Chuck Vu was on the line. Chuck was the last man standing from the Abraham Skunk Works, the only one of the three of us that hadn't been institutionalized, and the only one that still had a job at IM. He was the production engineer responsible for bringing the solenoid into existence. He had built a mock-up under James's personal instruction. The device was so ugly that we started calling it the Beast in our lab notes. It was not uncommon or sniffed at if Chuck was on campus well into the night. Seth extrapolated that there was every possibility that no one would be watching a good boy like Chuck anyway. Chuck wasn't a good boy, and his major vices were being a dumb drunk and an awful gambler. He owed me so much money from shooting dice on the docks at IM that it was easy for Seth to sling him over a barrel. All Seth did was point at me while I yelled at the phone. Franken almost offed himself because he was snowed under, because of how much you owe him. And meanwhile, you're still working at the place that canned him and not paying the debt back. Insult. Injury. He almost died floating you. You want that on your conscience? No, you don't. But it could happen if we don't get our hands on that thing. Chuck didn't agree to facilitate our entrance onto the campus, but he didn't say no. And if he did come through, I knew that sooner or later we were going to need some test subjects in order to calibrate the beams of electricity between the iron discs. Seth and I were sitting on the patio arguing over who in their right minds would willingly sit in a room long enough to get jacked up with electricity when Providence shuffled by. Brumman! I followed the smell of hard liquor to the bubbling sound of Lester Green's voice. Brumman, what you gonna do about this dirty old porch? I watched a patch of dead grass clinging onto Lester's shabby afro as he leaned on the wrought iron fence for dear life. What's that, Lester? Seth exhaled like a benevolent dictator from his wicker throne. Lester had a bad case of liquid on the lungs. Say, man, I'm trying to get me $1 or $2 together before Spirits closes for the night. You know I ain't gonna take your money for free, though. You know I'll sweep. He squawked up a yank of phlegm and hacked it out into the gutter. Seth looked him up and down and lamented. I know you're good for it, Les, but you got the right porch at the wrong time. I've been running on fumes all summer long. The smile dropped off of Lester's face as he pondered the contents of his pockets and considered his next move for the night. Say, Les, how about you come to my church on Sunday? Let me sweep your soul. Seth made his very first pitch. Now, Lester was a notorious local drunk, but he still had enough sobriety left to be skeptical. What kind of church you running? He squinted one jaundiced eye at the would-be holy man and whispered, Y'all smoking weed? Nah, Seth snorted. This is for real church. He slid his leg off the chair's bamboo arm. Seth popped and creaked up onto 2 feet to boast. I'm being straight with you, brother. He did a little 2-step shuffle. Seriously, I got that Holy Ghost plugged into my soul, and I'm just trying to let that light shine out to all y'all poor, wandering folks that could use the Lord so bad. You could have done the high dive off of Lester's bottom lip. It was just dangling there beneath a bubble of spit. Huh? Seth brushed himself off and stepped over to Lester. You want miracles, brother? Is that what you need? Because you best believe I'm bringing miracles. You like singing? I'm gonna sing the devil right out of town. How about you come by and I'll give that old demon liquor a swift kick in the caboose? Seth's fist snatched evil spirits right out of the air. Lester was thoroughly unsold. Nah, I'm good. Seth wasn't above contradiction when it came to getting what he wanted. Well, never mind that. How about if I throw in some wine and crackers to get you straight? You show up then? Lester perked up and spread his hands. Well, my soul ain't all that hungry. But you give over that old vino and hell, I'll probably sit there if you got something to say. He snorted and threw a shrug in. No shit. Seth was so overcome with the jolt from his first conversion that he let his halo slip for a second. But he recovered. You got any friends you could bring with you? Nah, I don't know about all that mess. But you go down to Kitchens and you get you plenty of people that'll turn after that wine. Bet. The homeless wouldn't ask a lot of questions that I wasn't comfortable providing explanations for, and they do the little bit that I wanted them to do, mostly for free. Mental illness was bound to be present in some of these folks, and that might futz with the results, but we were desperate at that point, and beggars can't be choosers. Besides, if anything went wrong, they had few advocates to come looking for them, and no one to press charges on their behalf if we mucked something up. The assets kept presenting themselves to us. Seth sent Lester off with a Lucy and then went in to design a handbill with all the relevant information for our dress rehearsal. The leaflets read, From the gutter to the pulpit, God finally shows his face.
This Sunday, 4 p.m., fellowship and brotherhood comes to all at the First Electric Church of Jesus Christ, 2950 Commerce Street. Closer to thee, Lord, closer to thee. Come this Sunday, we'll all be much closer to thee.
Next morning, Seth steamrolled the girl at the copy shop on Field Street and ended up printing up 500 flyers for him for free. We split up on the way home and started roaming all over the neighborhood, passing out handbills at the homeless shelters, the food kitchens, the work programs, the Department of Health and Human Services, the drunk tank, and any occupied stoop we could find. The street people were out in force, and Seth reminded every drifter we saw trying to catch change that the service was on Sunday and there would be wine for anyone who showed up. We walked the streets with him and passed out the remainder of our flyers by 1 a.m. Chuck called Fat's phone on Saturday morning. He had penciled himself onto the lab schedule for that evening under the pretense that he was overseeing the crating of the production model of the Beast for shipment. Seth yelled at Fat to bring his mom's station wagon. That night, Fat drove us down into the darkness of the service road along I-20 until Seth spotted the dangling chain at the side gate that Chuck had told us to look for. In the paranoia that had preceded Dr. Abraham's exit from IM, he had come up with an exploitation of a glitch in the network programming that disabled the campus's security cameras long enough for him to spirit bits of his work under the noses of the brass at IM. I knew about this. Chuck knew about this. And Chuck used it to disable the relevant security cameras while he wheeled the Beast from the old lab to the shipping dock. Fat's phone started vibrating. I put my gloves on and hopped out of the back. I opened the gate for Fat to pull in through. There was a dead zone that Chuck had timed out in the patrol guard's routine circuit around the roads on campus. We had 2 minutes to get away from the gate and behind the roll-up door at the shipping dock before the next golf cart patrol crossed our path of travel. We made it just in time. Fat and I had just gotten the door rolled back down in time when I turned around and saw the slumped security guard behind the dead bank of monitors. Chuck had volunteered to slip a soma into the guard's grape soda at dinner break while the two were involved in a little game of dice that Chuck predictably lost. Chuck was leaning over him with his hand in the sleeping guard's shirt pocket. He retrieved the cash that he'd lost in the dice game and then pushed the Beast the rest of the way over to the car. Its disproportionate weight and technological gravitas were concealed inside of one shabby cardboard box. The four of us were panting by the time we finally got the thing situated in the back of the car. We jumped in while Chuck went to watch until the patrol guard had puttered by on his second pass along the circuit. Once the golf cart was out of earshot, Chuck hit the button and the roll-up door retracted. It had begun to rain. The Volvo was already rolling when Chuck hopped in the back. Raindrops raced to the ground like children mad for candy. Fat couldn't see where he was going with his lights off. He kept bumbling off the main macadam and into the landscaping, and Seth kept shouting out impatient directions, which only made things worse. In a freaked-out fluster of frustration, Fat finally flipped his lights on and made a drenching dash for the gate to the service road. En route to our egress, Fat hit a curb and went 2 up and 2 down for a heartbeat and a half. Chuck didn't jump out of the car. He was unceremoniously shoved out the back door when the Beast shifted. He skidded in his loafers on the wet and muddy grass and only just caught himself before the swinging security fence made a waffle out of his face. There wasn't much breath left over for good luck, instructions, or goodbyes, so Fat just tapped his brakes to say thanks and then he gunned it onto the service road. The pre-planned cover-up called for Chuck to put the chain and lock back on the gate and to get himself back to the dock without getting caught. Back at the loft, Seth and Fat muscled the Beast up the stairs while I mounted a pulley at the far end of the maintenance corridor. It was up to me to muscle it down makeshift plywood rails through the claustrophobic corridor while the two of them played tug-of-war with a pulley line. Once the Beast was up there in its secret lair and away from prying eyes, I connected a single-phase relay to the heavy black cables that I had dropped down into the left and right walls that fed the magnetic disc. I tightened the final thumb screws on the battery posts. I hit enter on my laptop. The relay triggered a sympathetic shiver that quivered along the black snakes of cables that had fed into the walls. The readout registered random pulses of nanosecond-long microburst chirping. I watched the beady row of crow's eyes on the relay blink from red to yellow and onward to green. The beast had come.